Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere a little grim. But don't worry, you're already doomed. You open your eyes to a horizon washed in the pale, brackish light of dawn. A Roman port that smells like 100,000 fish have chosen this exact moment to expire in unison. Gulls scream overhead, circling the docks as if personally offended by your arrival. The planks beneath your sandals are slick with brine and something unidentifiable you'd rather not consider. You'd think about heading back to the boat, but the tide has already pulled it away. And anyway, you've committed to this. You're here to learn exactly what it was like to visit a Roman fish sauce factory. And there's no refund for curiosity. A young boy with hollow cheeks drags a basket half his size past you, leaking some sort of glistening sludge that clings to your ankles. You probably won't survive this, but let's pretend you will not so. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your city and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off the creaking boat and nearly skid onto your back, arms pinwheeling. Like some hapless comedy extra, the dockmaster gives you a single glance, shrugs, and resumes tallying amphorae as though another gawking visitor is the least of his worries all round. Stevedores stoop under loads of salted fish, each step leaving a wet slap in their wake. The air tastes like someone boiled seawater and old anchovies into a vaporous stew, and you can't help inhaling it in shallow, horrified gulps. You adjust the edge of your tunic across your mouth. But it's a futile gesture. Fabric is no match for centuries of perfected pungency. Your gaze drifts to the warehouse doors standing ajar, revealing shadows that flicker against low torchlight. A pair of donkeys lurch past, their panniers stuffed with heaps of fish so fresh their glassy eyes still stare at nothing. As you follow in their wake, you catch the first real sense of what awaits you, an operation so large and so methodical. It might almost be admirable if it didn't also feel like a slow-motion assault on every one of your senses. You edge closer to the threshold, the boards beneath your feet warping with damp. Here, history isn't some polished mosaic or triumphal arch. It's a living, breathing testament to the fact that Rome would industrialize even its condiments. An older man with a face carved into deep grooves waves you forward, his hand stained to the wrist with brownish fluid. He mumbles something that might be Latin, Greek, or simply a prayer for your survival. You nod because any other response seems inadequate. Inside, the noise grows wood on paddle string vats, the rasp of scoops against terracotta, and the constant splatter of brine dripping from every surface. Your sandals slip a little more with each step, until it feels as though the factory floor has ambitions to swallow you whole. Remember that damp tunic. It's now only one notch removed from a sponge dot at the far end of the hall. A group of laborers works in silence, their eyes downcast as they drag baskets of small fish mackerel, anchovies, sardines toward the salting yards. You trail behind, but the dockmaster barks a terse command, and you're shuffled into a dim corridor where the air grows warmer and somehow even more saturated with scent. You'd give anything for a breeze, or better yet, a sealed modern jar of sauce instead of this swamp of raw ingredients. But no, here, you're on Rome's terms, and Rome doesn't care if you gag. A heap of broken amphorae lines the path, shards jutting like the ribs of some enormous carcass. They crunch underfoot, their edges whispering reminders that every batch of fish sauce comes with casualties, spilled loads, cracked jars, and the inevitable seepage that glues itself to walls and skin alike. Historians still argue whether these breakages were accidental or simply inevitable in an operation this vast. Either way, you step gingerly, aware that a single misstep could reward you with a laceration and a fresh excuse to smell worse. Then, you already do dot at last. You emerge onto a second platform overlooking the main yard, where rows of vats stretch as far as you can see. Each basin bubbles gently, exhaling reek so potent it feels alive, curling its fingers up your nose and behind your eyes. You blink tears you'll pretend are only from the fumes. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but so are your neighbors, and you suspect they'd prefer it that way if it spared them this place. Below, a team of workers methodically stirs the vats with oar-length paddles. Their arms move in a hypnotic rhythm. And you realize this is only the beginning of your immersion. You have not yet truly arrived, no. Arrival here means stepping closer, inhaling deeper, letting the atmosphere press itself into every pore dot so you descend the slick wooden stairs. One trembling hand skimming the rail, your other hand braced protectively across your chest. As you reach the bottom, a boy no older than 12 shuffles past carrying a wicker basket overflowing with salt. His expression doesn't change when a trickle of brine splashes onto your foot. If anything, he looks faintly amused. You wonder, how many visitors have walked this path before you? How many have staggered back to their ships desperate to scrub away the memory? No one here will offer you pity. You're simply another outsider daft enough to see the marvel firsthand. And marvel you do at the scale, the labor, and the fact that even the greatest empire in the world was built partly on something that smells like a trash heap left too long in the sun. You pause to catch your breath, but it doesn't help. The air is thick with the quiet certainty that you're only just beginning to understand what this place demands. You trudge forward from the docks and find yourself at the edge of a sprawling courtyard weather. Salting yards sprawl in dusty, odor-warped lines. The sun finally clears the rim of the rooftops, bathing everything in a yellow glare that makes the heaps of fish glisten like piles of miniature opals if opals came with the unshocker. Bold conviction you might never smell clean. Again, a worker hoists a woven basket to his shoulder, and the salt spills over the brim, hissing against the scales below as though the fish themselves are protesting this final indignity. You shuffle sideways to avoid the runoff, but the ground here is a patchwork of grit and old brine, so your sandals squelch anyway. Each step sounds like a private embarrassment. The man nearest you pauses his work just long enough to squint in your direction, as if to confirm you're not actually here. To help, satisfied that you're only a spectator, he resumes layering the fish in the great rectangular trough, adding salt in thick, methodical handfuls. It's strangely beautiful in a grim, processional way, like watching a ritual designed to transform ordinary creatures into something both valuable and vaguely horrifying. Historians still argue whether the precise proportions of fish to salt were common knowledge or the guarded secrets of each garum producer. You have the sense that no one here will be explaining the recipe to you, not when you're already having trouble standing still without a etc. dot as you edge along the perimeter. You catch a glimpse of a wooden plaque, its Latin letters scrawled, in a hand that looks hurried. Caution uneven ground. Keep clear of loading carts. The caution seems more wishful than practical. You step round a fresh spill of silvery fish and find your foot skidding again, landing with a jolt that sends a pang up your leg. Your damp tunic flaps against your calf, sticking in places where the salt has fused with yesterday's sweat. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but so are your ambitions to stay dry, dignified, or remotely comfortable. You wonder if the salting yard workers feel the same creeping resignation, or if they've long since stopped noticing. A boy, perhaps 10 years old, emerges from behind a half wall of amphory. He carries a little scoop of salt and, with solemn concentration, sprinkles it across the surface of an open vat. He doesn't look up when you pass, his small shoulders set in that determined, Weary angle you recognize from every laborer here. You try not to imagine how many years he'll spend in this yard. His childhood gradually replaced by the same grinny routines that now gnaw at your sense of time. You pause at the far corner, where a larger trough is being drained. A man with a face like an uncarved block of wood levers a plank aside, and a stream of opaque liquid sluices into a collecting trench. The stench rises in a visible shimmer. A reminder that the salt isn't just a preservative, it's the first step in turning fresh fish into something that can survive the journey across half the known world. Remember that damp tunic. It's now blessed with a whole new layer of saline misery. You watch the workers tilt the trough to dislodge the last of the fish, which slump onto the planks in a sluggish heap. It's hard not to feel that you're witnessing a slow metamorphosis, one that transforms life into commodity. One man scoops the residue with a broad wooden paddle, moving as though the motion has become as automatic as breathing. You almost envy him, except you can't quite imagine ever getting used to this. A soft breeze drifts across the yard, momentarily stirring the salt-dusted air into something like relief. You pull your tunic higher over your nose and pretend it helps. For a moment, you catch the tang of the sea beyond the walls, clean, bright, and tainted. Then the breeze shifts, and you're back in the heavy, fish-thick atmosphere. You shuffle along another row of vats, where the salt is piled in perfect pyramids, each a testament to the meticulousness of Roman logistics. Even here, in the most unglamorous corner of Empire, order reigns. There's something almost comforting about the discipline until you remember that you're standing ankle-deep in brine, the soles of your feet beginning to feel as though they're pickling. A worker lifts a basket onto a cart, and you step aside to let him pass. The cart's wooden wheels leave damp tracks across the yard, pointing the way to the fermentation pits you've been studiously avoiding. But you know you'll end up there soon enough. Everyone here ends up there eventually. You pause by a half-finished amphora, its rim crusted with salt. You trail a fingertip along the edge, then regret it instantly as the grit embeds under your nail. There's a low hum of activity all round, a chorus of scraping, shoveling, and quiet groans. Historians still argue whether Roman garum was truly beloved or simply tolerated out of necessity. Judging by the expressions of the workers, you suspect it's a little of both. You linger for a moment longer, trying to memorize the sight, the endless rows of troughs, the piles of salt that look almost pristine from a distance, and the faces of people who will rise tomorrow to do this all again. You imagine telling someone back home about your visit, trying to convey the scale of it without sounding like you've lost your mind. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. And so is any illusion you had that history smells like parchment and roses. It smells like this, like damp fish and stubborn salt and 100 quiet compromises. When you finally step away from the salting yards, your sandals leave prints in the slurry that pools between the paving stones. You don't look back. The stench clings to you as though it has recognized you for what you are, a temporary interloper, soon to be driven away by your own squeamishness. But you keep walking, because there is more to see, and the worst of it is still waiting. You shuffle away from the salting yards with the cautious gait of someone who's just realized there is no safe path in any direction. The ground squelches beneath you, each footstep sounding like an unfortunate secret you can't stop repeating. Ahead, the main corridor yawns open, lit by fitful torches wedged into iron brackets along the wall. The flicker of flame casts the shadows of passing workers onto the damp masonry, making them loom and shrink as if the factory itself is breathing. The figure materializes from the gloom, startling you into nearly stepping backward into a fresh mound of salted fish. He's tall, with a spine that bends to the left, and his tunic is a patchwork of brown stains you don't want to name. This, you suspect, is the closest thing the factory has to a guide. The overseer lifts a hand in a gesture that's both greeting and surrender, and without waiting for your consent, he turns and begins to walk. You have no choice but to follow, your sandals whispering against the damp floor as you trail behind. The overseer moves with the measured pace of a man, resigned to explaining the same things to visitors who will never truly understand. He angles his face over one shoulder just enough to mutter, "Mind the boards," and gestures vaguely to the floor. You glance down and see a loose plank tilting over a shallow trench. When you step round it, you realize the trench is full of runoff-thin rivulets of liquid that look innocuous until a closer sniff proves otherwise. He says something else, more a series of syllables than a sentence, and it's clear he's warning you about the else, whether he means live eels or some older, less definable shape of life. You can't quite tell. You nod as though this makes perfect sense. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But so is your last scrap of hope that you will ever unsmell any of this. He leads you deeper into the labyrinth of stone corridors. The walls are etched with long, dark streaks where barrels have been dragged over countless seasons. You pass a heap of splintered staves stacked in the corner, their jagged ends resembling a barricade, though you know they are only discards. Historians still argue whether these old boards were deliberately broken to discourage theft or simply collapsed under the weight of too many harvests. Either way, you keep your hands to yourself. At intervals, small alcoves open up on either side, each one crammed with clay amphorae that look almost dignified in the torchlight. The overseer raps his knuckles against a jar in passing. The sound is low, hollow, and final. Like a heartbeat that doesn't care whether you're listening. You try to keep count of the turns left, right, left again, but you lose track after the fifth junction. Each passage smells subtly different. Some rank with raw fish, others with the acrid tang of fermenting brine, and some with a note so sour it almost makes your eyes water. The overseer doesn't seem to notice, or perhaps he's simply immune. Your tunic clings to your ribs in clammy folds, and your scalp feels damp under the filmy press of the air. Remember that damp tunic. It's upgraded itself to a full-body marinade. The man ahead slows without warning, then lifts one long arm to point down the next hallway. There, a narrow doorway gapes like a wound in the stone. Beyond it, you glimpse a wider chamber, lit by a row of torches and the glimmer of liquid in sunken pits. He turns to you, his mouth twisting in something that might be pity or amusement. You'll see, he rasps, then steps aside so you can pass. You hesitate, but he's already leaning his shoulder to the wall, folding his arms as though his work is done. You breathe once, shallow and cautious, then step through, inside. Ceiling rises, the walls blackened by years of torch soot. The air thickens until it feels like you're walking into a soup. And in the middle of this cavernous room, the vats await vast, circular basins sunk into the ground, each glistening with a dark, viscous mass. This is where the real transformation happens. The fish you saw layered with salt are left to dissolve, under the sun and time, their bodies giving up every trace of structure until nothing remains but a thin slurry. Wooden paddles lean against the rims, their handles crusted with salt. From somewhere nearby comes the sound of bubbles breaking the surface in slow, irregular sighs. Historians still argue whether these fermentation pits were refined innovations, or simply Rome's most convenient compromise with decay. But in this moment, you suspect they're both. A worker stands at the nearest vat, dragging a paddle in a slow circle. The movement is so hypnotic that for a moment you forget to breathe. Then the smell hits you, a reek that seems to crawl down your throat and sit in your stomach. You stagger back a half step, catching yourself on the rim. The worker doesn't look up. The overseer's voice floats from the doorway. You taste later. You try not to shudder. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but if it weren't, you'd be scrolling for a distraction. You imagine explaining this moment to someone how you came all this way just to watch fish melt. You doubt you would be able to. Do it just as stop the worker drags the paddle through the vat again, lifting it just high enough for a slick strand of liquid to trail back down. It lands with a sound, that is, somehow. The worst thing you've ever heard. You swallow and pretend. You're fine. You step along the edge, peering into each bit in turn. Some are more advanced mere pools of liquid that gleam with iridescent scum, while others still hold the ragged outlines of fish too stubborn to dissolve all at once. The torches flare in the draft, casting everything in shifting shadows. For a moment, you think you see movement beneath the surface, but you decide it's safer not to look too closely. Remember the overseer's warning about the eels? You suddenly wish you'd asked for clarification. You edge along the perimeter of the fermentation pits, each step a delicate negotiation with your own stomach. The heat in here is different, thicker, more persistent, like you're wrapped in a damp blanket you never agreed to wear. Every breath feels as if it arrives pre-seasoned, warm and acrid, crawling into the back of your throat where it lingers long after you exhale. One pit gurgles in a slow, unsettling rhythm, as though something alive is exhaling from under the surface. You're not entirely sure it isn't. Historians still argue whether workers ever fell into these vats by accident, or whether such stories are just the sort of cautionary tales Romans like to whisper aft. At too much wine, you look into the nearest basin and decide you'd rather not test the theory yourself. A ladder leans against the rim of the largest vat, and you can see where someone has scuffed their sandals climbing in to stir or retrieve a sample. The sides are stained in descending bands, marking where the level has slowly receded over the weeks of fermentation. Each line a quiet testament to time passing in slow, fishy increments. You swallow hard and step closer to the lip. The surface of the liquid shifts as you approach, rippling outward in sluggish rings. Something bobs briefly before sinking again, and you choose to believe it was only a stray fin rather than evidence of something that never made it back out. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But even if it worked, you doubt a video call would capture the particular, all-consuming stench. You imagine holding the screen up to this view, your friends recoiling in horror, your own face trapped in a perpetual grimace, at least here. No one expects you to look composed. To your right, a worker hauls up a wooden bucket on a rope, hand over hand. As the vessel clears the rim, you see the glistening slurry inside gray brown, flecked with scales and unidentifiable bits. He tips it carefully into a shallow basin, where it will be strained and refined. The splash is muffled and wet, and you feel it echo somewhere behind your ribs. Remember that damp tunic? It's still there, only now it's picked up a sour edge you'll be smelling in your dreams. You run a hand across your hair, half expecting it to come away sticky. It does. The overseer appears at your elbow, his expression as impassive as ever. He jerks his thumb toward a stack of clay amphorae lined up along the back wall. Ready soon, he rasps, as though this clarifies anything. You nod like it does. He drifts away, leaving you alone with the vats and your own regrettable curiosity. You take a hesitant step toward the next pit, peering into its depths. The torchlight flickers across the surface, illuminating a swirling constellation of scales suspended in liquid. For a moment, you can almost appreciate the strange beauty of it, a galaxy of decomposing fish suspended in time. Then the smell intensifies, and you stagger back, blinking tears you won't bother wiping away. A worker crosses in front of you, balancing a long-handled sieve. He dips it into the basin, stirring carefully. Each stroke sends a new wave of odor billowing upward, as if the pit resents being disturbed. You imagine the entire room as a living lung, exhaling its sour breath every time someone moves. You watch as he lifts the sieve, letting the liquid drain into a pail below. The remains are dumped into a shallow trough, where they'll be pressed for every last drop of value. Nothing here is wasted, nothing gets to simply disappear. Historians still argue whether this efficiency was driven by necessity or simply the Roman obsession with order. You suspect both. A soft scraping sound draws your gaze to a corner where another worker kneels by a smaller vat, methodically sealing its lid with a thick ring of clay. He smooths it with slow, practiced gestures as if he's tucking the vat in for a long sleep. You envy it. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But so is any remaining illusion that this was going to be a polite little field trip. You're fully committed now, ankle deep in the reality of a process that no one romanticizes. You move carefully between the pits, your sandals making faint sucking sounds as you go. The air shifts, carrying a fresh wave of heat and a sudden, unexpected sweetness and edge of decay that almost smells like overripe fruit. You realize this is the final stage of fermentation. When the garum is nearly ready to be siphoned off and packed, you'd be impressed if you weren't so busy wishing you were anywhere else. A voice murmurs something behind you. You turn, expecting the overseer again. But it's only a worker muttering to himself as he pries loose the stopper on another vat. You watch as the liquid begins to flow down a narrow channel cut into the floor, trickling away to be collected and strained. The smell seems to follow it like an invisible tether. Remember that damp tunic. You're starting to think it has permanently fused to your skin. You try to imagine stepping back into the sunlight and feeling clean again. But the thought feels almost absurd. You drift to the far wall where a line of amphorae waits to be filled. Some are marked with painted symbols denoting quality, destination, or perhaps warnings. You rest your hand lightly on one, feeling the cool clay beneath your palm for a moment. The solidity is comforting, a reminder that all this will end up as something neatly contained, labeled, and traded far from this place. But you know the truth. No matter how far it travels, this smell will never quite leave you. You stand there with your hand on the emperor, as if its solidity might anchor you in this world of drifting fumes and shifting shadows. But nothing can disguise the fact that you are in the belly of a process designed to break things down. Fish, barrels, human fortitude. The emperor is simply the next stage in the journey. A vessel to carry all this brine-soaked effort into Roman kitchens where wealthy diners will slave it over roasted meats and pretend it's refined. A voice rasps behind you, startling you into a small, inelegant jump. The overseer has reappeared, holding something that looks suspiciously like a ladle. He gestures with a solemn finality you don't dare defy. You feel a curious sense of doom as he dips the ladle into a half-filled amphora, stirring with the same slow precision you've seen everywhere. Then, with a single efficient motion, he tips the ladle toward you. A thin trickle of warm, amber liquid wobbles into a shallow wooden cup, steaming faintly in the torchlight. You realize, with mounting dread, that this is your moment. The overseer's eyes fix on you with the mild challenge of someone who's seen 100 visitors hesitate and doesn't mind watching you do the same. You take the cup with two hands, feeling its heat seep through your fingers. For one hopeful instant, you wonder if you might pretend to sip. But no, he watches too intently. You brace yourself, raise the cup to your lips, and tip a swallow into your mouth. The taste is complicated. It starts salty, so salty your tongue flinches, then blossoms into something deeper like anchovies left in a sun-warmed cupboard until they liquefy into a single, pungent essence. It's not entirely awful, not entirely. But it's a taste that demands a place in your memory whether you consent or not. Remember that damp tunic. You'd trade it for a fresh one in an instant, if only to distract yourself from this new, fishy resonance in your sinuses. The overseer nods, apparently satisfied. He takes the cup back with a flicker of amusement, as if to say, "See, you survived." Though you suspect this is only partly true. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But you know you'd be recording this moment if it weren't your expression alone would make for immortal content. You imagine your friends watching you gag in slow motion, raising their eyebrows in solidarity or horror. You clear your throat and try to focus on something else, anything else. Your gaze lands on the rows of amphorae lined along the wall, each painted with a red stripe and stamped with a seal. The overseer sees your interest and gestures with the label, "Export." He mutters, you nod solemnly, as if you have any authority over where this fishy slurry will end up. Historians still argue whether garum was considered a luxury for the elite or a staple for every Roman household. Some accounts claim it was worth more than wine. Others that it was so ubiquitous no one thought twice about it. You suspect the truth, as always, is somewhere in the middle. You step back, your feet sticking briefly to the damp floor, and watch as another worker approaches with a long-handled funnel. He inserts it into the mouth of an amphora and begins to pour a slow, gurgling cascade that coats the clay interior in shimmering layers. It's mesmerizing if you let your mind slip far enough from your body. You wonder, as you watch, whether anyone in Rome ever paused to consider the labor behind this delicacy. Whether senators in their villas knew that each amphora was born of weeks of slow decay and endless stirring. Whether they ever imagined the boy with salt-stung hands hold the baskets, or the overseer who measured each batch by eye. Your throat feels dry despite the lingering taste. So you move to the side, giving the workers space to finish. Astray, drape lands on the toe of your sandal and starts its inexorable journey toward your heel. You sigh, because this seems inevitable. Remember the first moment you stepped off the boat. How the smell seemed overwhelming then. Now it feels almost normal, or at least you've surrendered to it. You drift toward a smaller vat set apart from the others. The liquid here is lighter in color, almost golden, and the surface glitters with tiny bubbles. This is the prized upper layer, the finest grade reserved for wealthy patrons. The overseer taps the rim with his ladle, raising his eyebrows in a silent question. You shake your head so quickly you nearly unbalance yourself. He chuckles a soft, hoarse sound and moves on. You realize then that you're learning something profound, if uncomfortable. Every civilization has its hidden corners where the work never stops, where the glamour of empire is paid for in sweat and smell. This is Rome's single quote says. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But you suspect no filter or caption could improve this moment anyway. You tuck your hands into your damp tunic and watch as the amphorae are sealed one by one, each bearing the quiet promise of future dinners and future stories. As the overseer turns to check the next row, you take a moment to breathe carefully, shallowly, and let the reality sink in. You've tasted what most only hear about. You stood at the edge of the process and felt it seep into your hair, your clothes, your memory. And you suspect it will be a long time before you stop smelling it. You step back from the overseer and the final, gleaming amphorae, feeling as though you've just witnessed the last rites of some peculiar ceremony. The workers move around you with steady and hurried precision, each task part of a rhythm so ingrained they don't need to speak. You try not to think about the fact that your own skin has become a participant in this process now. Longer merely an observer, but an unwilling carrier of the smell. Your gaze wanders to a tall rack stacked floor to ceiling with seal jars. The terracotta bulges slightly where the pressure of the liquid pushes outward. And you imagine the ancient containers, sighing in their sleep, dreaming of the moment they'll be cracked open in distant kitchens. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But if it weren't, you'd be tempted to Google whether any amphorae survived intact all the way to Britannia. The thought of this brine crossing mountains and seas only to be dumped into a stew is somehow both absurd and impressive. You inch away from the finished stockpile and move toward the next chamber, a space that feels more like a storeroom than a factory floor. The ceiling drops lower, the air thickening with the dusty dampness that clings to your face. Here, the amphorae are packed tighter together, some stacked in haphazard pyramids, others nestled on straw mats that do nothing to mask the persistent reek. A young man stoops beside a crate of broken jars, lifting the shards one by one and sorting them into baskets. His hands are deft, almost tender in the way he handles each fragment. You watch as he turns a piece over in his palm, inspecting the painted mark that still shows faint red beneath the salt crust. Historians still argue whether these marks were brands of prestige or simple batch numbers, and in this dim space, it's hard to imagine either explanation matters very much. Remember that damp tunic. It's clinging harder now, almost as though it has decided you belong to this place. You shuffle forward, careful not to trip over the lattice of straw and pottery. The worker glances up at you briefly, his eyes bright in the gloom, then returns to his sorting. For a moment you envy the simplicity of his focus, how clean it must feel to have one job, no matter how repetitive. Then you remember the blisters on his hands and reconsider. Against the far wall, a small brazier smolders, the coals sending up a curl of heat that fails to overpower the colder drafts drifting in from unseen cracks. You hold your hands to the warmth, but the comfort is shallow. Every time you breathe, the air tastes of brine and old fish, a flavor that seems determined to saturate your thoughts. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but so is any pretense that you'll wash this off in a single bath. You suspect you'll be dreaming of this storeroom of the stacked amphorae and the slow, endless work long after you leave. Your gaze catches on a niche at the back of the chamber. It's no bigger than a cupboard, but inside, a shelf holds a curious assortment: clay measuring cups, a dented brass funnel, a scrap of wax tablet bearing half-legible notes. You step closer, drawn by the intimacy of it. These are the tools that make the process human, the small evidence that someone thought about quantities and quality long after the novelty wore off. You lift a measuring cup, feeling the weight of it in your palm. The rim is chipped, worn smooth by countless hands. For a moment you imagine a worker standing here in the dawnlight, tallying a batch with the same tired resignation you feel now. Historians still argue whether these simple tools were standardized across the empire or left to the discretion of each factory. Either way, they have the quiet authority of objects that outlast their owners. You set the cup back carefully, reluctant to disturb the arrangement further. Remember that damp tunic. It's now warm from the brazier, which somehow makes it worse. Wet, steamy embrace you never asked for. You take one more look around the chamber. The walls are streaked with old splashes, the floor pitted where amphorae have been dropped or dragged. In one corner, a stack of lids leans at a precarious angle, threatening to topple if you so much as breathe too hard. You turn away, unwilling to tempt fate. Your steps carry you back toward the corridor, where the light brightens and the air grows marginally fresher. It's a relative improvement. You still feel as though you're breathing through a fish-scented cloth, but at least the press of the ceiling eases, and you can stand a little straighter. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you know if it worked, you'd be texting someone to say you've seen enough, that you're ready to go home. But you also know you'll keep walking, because something in you needs to see it all to understand every layer of this slow alchemy. You pause at the threshold, glancing back one last time. The young man has returned to sorting shards. The brazier still burns, and the amphorae wait, patient as stones. You exhale a breath you didn't realize you were holding and step forward, because there is more to witness. and you suspect this factory hasn't finished teaching you how small and temporary you are. You emerge from the storage chamber blinking, into a paler, dustier light. Here, the walls widen into a low-ceilinged gallery lined with thin straw pallets. You pause, struck by the hush that settles over this space. A hush that feels heavier than any clamor of tools or barrels. This is the place where the workers collapse, hour after hour, to steal a scrap of rest between shifts. The air is warmer here, though not in a way that comforts you. It feels close, exhausted. As if all the breath that has ever passed through this room still lingers salt-laden and heavy. You step gingerly between the rows of straw, careful not to disturb the rough blankets and the few possessions tucked beside each mat. A chipped cup, a folded scrap of linen, a tiny amulet strung on twine. Historians still argue whether these quarters were considered a kindness or a necessity, whether Rome believed it generous to provide a place to sleep at all. You look at the thin mats and wonder if generosity ever entered the conversation. Remember that. Damp tunic, it's stuck to your ribs now. So much a part of you that you have expected to sprout scales. You drift past a row of men sprawled in uneven lines. Most are motionless, chests rising and falling in a slow, dog rhythm. One stirs, rolling onto his side with a soft grunt. Another scratches absently at his hair, never opening his eyes. The hush deepens, a solemnity that almost feels sacred. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But if it weren't, you'd be tempted to snap a picture of this human mosaic, proof that history wasn't all marble columns and triumphal arches. It was also rooms like this, close, dim, and reeking of sweat and brine. A boy no older than 12 lies curled in the corner, his thin arm pillowed under his cheek. His hair is clumped with salt, and his feet are bare, dusted gray from the yard. You try not to stare, but your gaze keeps returning to that fragile shape, to the way his shoulders rise with each careful breath. Remember the overseer's warning about the ills. You find yourself wondering if he ever warned this boy about them more. If the warnings start mattering when you're too tired to care. You step back, your heel brushing against a shallow basket that someone has pushed out of the way. Inside, a few crusts of bread lie wrapped in cloth, alongside a handful of olives shriveled to dark nubs. You swallow, feeling your own hunger stir uncomfortably under the fatigue. The bread looks about as appetizing as everything else you've encountered here, but you suspect for the workers it's a welcome comfort. A draft whispers through the doorway, carrying a brief reprieve from the smell, though it leaves behind a chill that settles on your damp skin. You shiver, pressing your hands to your arms, and wonder how anyone manages to sleep in air that tastes of sour brine. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But so are any expectations you had that this journey would be neatly educational. It's something else entirely more intimate, more unsettling. A low murmur draws your attention to the far wall, where an older man sits propped against the stone, his legs stretched out before him. He's humming a slow, wavering tune that barely carries over the hush. His eyes are closed, but the hum persists, a thread of sound that feels almost defiant in its softness. You stand still, listening, until the tune dissolves back into silence. Historians still argue whether the workers here were slaves, free men, or some complicated mix of both. The records are incomplete, ambiguous, but as you watch the man's chest rise and fall, you think perhaps it doesn't matter so much because exhaustion looks the same in every century. You move toward the doorway again, grateful for the faint breeze that beckons you out. But you pause just before you step over the threshold, glancing back at the rows of bodies, the humble arrangements of cups and blankets. Remember that damp tunic? It's the least of your discomforts now. You suspect the deeper weight is something you'll carry longer, The knowledge that empire is built not only on ambition, but on the quiet persistence of people, who will never be remembered by name. You cross the sill and let the door swing shut behind you. The corridor feels brighter by contrast, the air slightly less oppressive. You draw a breath and feel it catch in your throat anyway. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you know no image could fully capture this space. It's something you have to carry in your memory, a tiny testament to the hidden lives beneath Rome's grand facade. You press your palm briefly to the cool wall, grounding yourself before you continue. Because there are still more rooms, more labor, and more reminders that history is never tidy. You lean away from the wall, your hand leaving a damp print on the plaster, drift down the corridor. Guided more by inevitability than intention, the floor slopes slightly, carrying a thin trickle of brine toward the exit you won't reach for hours yet. As you follow the rivulet, your sandals stick in slow. Deliberate rhythm, a small percussion of resignation. Soon, the passage opens. Onto a broad archway framed by thick wooden beams. Sunlight spills in from beyond. A shock of brightness after the hush of the sleeping quarters. You squint, one hand shading your face, and blink until the shapes resolve. A row of carts laden with amphorae, each jar cradled in straw to keep it from knocking its neighbor to pieces. This is the marketplace connection, the artery that will carry garum from this hidden place into the heart of Roman commerce. A pair of oxen stand harnessed to the nearest cart, their broad shoulders twitching as flies settle in search of moisture. A driver perches on the edge of the wagon, his legs dangling as he idly scrapes dried salt from his palm with a broken shard of pottery. Remember that damp tunic. The breeze here finds every wet seam, fluttering the fabric against your skin. A clowny ballet. You pretend it feels refreshing. You step into the yard and immediately regret it. The sunlight intensifies the smell, baking it into something richer, sweeter, and somehow even more pervasive. You feel it sinking into your scalp, clinging behind your ears. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but if it weren't, you'd be scrolling recipes just to remind yourself that food can be lovely. A young woman moves along the row of carts, checking seals and tying waxed cords round the necks of the jars. Her hands are quick, practiced, and she never pauses to wipe the sweat that drips from her temples. You catch her eye for an instant, but she looks past you without curiosity. Your presence is as ordinary as any other part of this. Trade historians still argue whether women were commonly employed in these final steps of garum production, or if this was an unusual arrangement. You suspect that in practice, no task was ever purely one person's domain. The process simply consumed whoever was available. At the far end of the yard, a buyer waits, his tunic crisp and his sandals conspicuously free of grime. He holds a wax tablet and stylus with the delicate disdain of someone who has never had to scoop fermenting fish in his life. A worker gestures for you to step aside as they maneuver a fresh barrel onto a handcart. You comply, hugging the wall, while the driver clicks his tongue at the oxen to inch forward. You catch fragments of negotiation drifting across the yard, the buyer's voice high and nasal, the seller's low and worn to gravel. You hear words you almost recognize: quality, shipment, Hispania. You imagine these same conversations happening in ports across the empire. Each transaction proof that no civilization is ever as clean as its monuments suggest. Remember the overseer's promise that you'd taste the product. You can still feel it on your tongue, a phantom flavor that makes your stomach roll when the wind changes. The buyer bends to inspect the amphora nearest him, prying the wax seal with the point of his stylus. You watch as he dips a small spoon into the opening, lifts it to his nose, and sniffs with theatrical care. Then he pulls a face at Tiny. Private grimace and quickly replaces the seal. You almost laugh, almost dot. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, But you give anything for a text from a friend reminding you the world is bigger than this yacht. A boy scurries past with a basket of fresh straw, dribbling clumps across your toes. You don't bother brushing them off. There's a point at which filth becomes inevitable, and you've long since crossed it. You step along the line of carts, your gaze catching on the painted symbols that declare their destinations. One reads Neapolis, another Ostia, another marked with a flourish you can't decipher. You think about how many kitchens will open these jars in the months to come. How many stews and sauces will carry the invisible echo of this place? Historians still argue whether the demand for garum was driven by taste or by the lack of better ways to preserve food. You suspect it was both an uneasy marriage of preference and necessity that left everyone equally resigned. Remember that damp tunic? The sun has turned it into a sauna, and you feel a trickle of sweat slide down your spine to join the general misery. The buyer straightens, scribbles something on his tablet, and gestures to the driver, who clocks his ton again. The oxen lean into their harnesses, and the first cart creaks away from the yard, leaving a trail of damp straw behind. You watch it disappear through the gate, a small reminder that history is always in motion. Even when it smells like this, you move toward the empty stretch of ground where the cart once stood. Feeling the heat of the sun on your neck, the worker, who replaced the sealed glances at you briefly before returning to his bundle of cords. For a moment, you feel invisible in the best possible way, one more figure passing through, collecting memories no one will ever ask about. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But so is any illusion that history's glory was built without the help of battles, salt, and the labor you've just witnessed. You exhale slowly and let your gaze wander to the next gate. You know by now that every threshold here leads to a new discomfort. But you also know you'll keep going, because you haven't seen everything yet. You step across the patch of sunlight where the cart stood only moments before, your foot squashing a sudden coil of straw into the ground. The air feels clearer without the oxen's patient sighing, but not by much, just enough for you to remember the baseline stench you've come to accept as your kunst. And companion. The next doorway yawns, open, taller and wider than any you've passed through yet. A beam of light angles across the threshold, catching motes of dust that hang suspended like tiny, silent observers. You duck your head and step inside. Here, the walls rise higher, the ceiling crossed with thick rafters blackened by years of smoke and damp. At first you think you're alone. Then you hear the soft rustle of footsteps and the quiet snort of an animal tethered somewhere in the gloom. Two men stand along the work table, heads bowed over an open amphora. One holds a thin rod with a tiny iron hook at the end, dipping it delicately inside. He swirls it twice, lifts it to his nose, and inhales with the resigned gravity of a priest performing rites. The other man scratches notes onto a wax tablet, his stylus moving in small, precise strokes. This is the inspection station, you realize, with a mild pang of dread, that you're about to see how the Empire ensures its condiments won't cause too much public outrage. Historians still argue whether these inspections were genuinely rigorous or merely a formality. Judging by the men's expressions, you suspect they do care, but not enough to spend any longer here than necessary. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you give anything for a distraction quiz. A meme, even the weather forecast in some clean place you'll never visit. You edge closer, watching as the inspector taps a little clump of sediment onto a shallow dish. He smears it with the tip of the hook, sniffing again before nodding once. The other man marks a symbol on the amphora's shoulder, a swirl that looks almost decorative, though you suspect it's anything but. Remember that damp tunic? It's begun to dry around the edges, which only makes the salt harden in rough, Seems against your ribs. The inspector glances up, notices you hovering like a curious ghost, and gives the barest hint of acknowledgement. Then he gestures at a row of other amphorae lined along the far wall. You follow his hand and see a spectrum of colors sealed behind wax stoppers, pale golden liquid, dark brown sludge, something in between that glows faintly in the torchlight. He mumbles something you can't quite catch, then uses the rod to point at one jar in particular. You think he's explaining the grading how the clearest. Most pungent liquid fetches the best price, while the sediment-rich batches are sold more cheaply. His voice is tired, but not unkind, and you imagine he's delivered the same little speech to countless other visitors, most of whom probably regretted asking. You nod in solemn appreciation, though you're not entirely sure what you're agreeing to. A sudden scrape echoes behind you. You turn to see a worker maneuvering a barrel onto a low cart as the wheels bump over the threshold. The liquid inside sloshes audibly, sending up a wave of sour air that presses against your face like a damp hand. You swallow and pretend you don't mind. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but so is any pretense that you'd ever want to taste garum again. The inspector returns to his task, and sealing the next amphora with a deft twist of his wrist, the lid comes away with a sticky pop, and he peers inside, frowning as though the jar has personally disappointed him. You edge closer out of morbid curiosity, catching a glimpse of a frothy, dun-colored surface that looks more like pond water than anything edible. Historians still argue whether the smell of garum was seen as proof of quality or just an unavoidable byproduct. You suspect there was a little of both pride and resignation, twined together like two ropes. Remember that damp tunic? It shifts against your skin every time you breathe, reminding you exactly how long you've been here. A runner appears in the doorway, a boy barely taller than the amphorae, clutching a folded scrap of parchment. He waits patiently as the inspector glances up, takes the message, and scans it with the bored efficiency of a man who rarely encounters surprises. Then he nods, flicks a crumb of wax from his stylus, and waves the boy away. The boy vanishes as quietly as he came, leaving you alone again with the men and the jars. The inspector replaces the lid, sealing it with a practiced press of his palm. Then he drags a finger through the dust along the amphora's shoulder, smearing the swirl he just marked for reasons you can't quite articulate. This feels like the most melancholy moment of your entire visit. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you imagine texting someone. It's stranger here than I ever guessed, but you know no one would understand until they stood here, too, breathing this air, feeling the weight of all these silent amphorae. You step back slowly, letting the inspectors continue their ritual. As you retreat toward the threshold, the torchlight flares behind you, throwing your shadow long across the packed earth. You look at it elongated, wavering, and think it suits you, because you become something half-real in this place, a figure passing through, collecting stories that don't quite belong to you but will stay anyway. You step out of the inspection hall, blinking against the sudden brightness of midday. The courtyard beyond looks almost clean after the dim corridors, though you know better than to trust first impressions. A line of carts idles along the far wall, each piled with fresh amphorae, their clay skins glowing warm under the sun. A boy scrambles past, trailing a coil of rope behind him that snakes across your path. You pause just in time to avoid stepping on it, feeling a thin thread of gratitude that you're still alert enough to dodge hazards. Even if you no longer care much about your dignity, remember that damp tunic. It's stiff now, the salt hardening into little crusty ridges that scrape the backs of your arms when you move. You drift along the wall, passing a stack of straw bales that exhale warm. Dusty scent that almost masks the underlying tang of brine. The carts are being loaded one by one, their drivers muttering instructions to the workers who heave each amphora into place with a grunt. You watch the process with the distant interest of someone too tired to feel invested but too fascinated to look away. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But if it weren't, you'd be checking how long you've been here. An hour, a day, a week. Time has blurred, melted by the relentless heat and the sameness of every corridor. One driver hops down from his cart and unrolls a brittle parchment, smoothing it on a nearby barrel. He traces his finger along the faded ink roots and tally marks that determine exactly where each load will end up. You lean closer, catching the names of cities you've only read about. Tarraco, Marsilia, Londinium. Each a distant dot where this place's smell will unfurl into someone's. Kirchen, someone's life. Historians still argue whether fish sauce was considered an exotic delicacy in the provinces or simply an expected staple. You imagine the amphory arriving in a cold, wet Britannia, cracked open in a smoky hall where diners wrinkle their noses and pretend not to mind. You edge toward the corner of the yard, where a low platform has been built on a shallow bit. A worker stoops inside, adjusting bundles of straw around a single amphora, one that gleams a little brighter than the others. It's seal marked with a painted red crescent. You wonder if this is a higher grade, or simply the result of some cloak swim. The worker straightens, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist, and gestures for you to come closer. You obey, though your legs feel like they've been traded for someone else as someone slower, heavier. He points at the amphora and says something you don't quite catch, but the tone is unmistakable. Pride. Remember that first moment you stepped off the boat, when the smell seemed intolerable. You can hardly remember what clean air tastes like. The man lifts the amphora by its narrow neck, bracing the base against his hip as he sets it carefully on a folded mat. The movement is precise, reverent in a way that startles you. You realize, watching him, that even here, even in this wearying work, there's room for a kind of care you hadn't expected. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But so is any illusion that you're simply an observer. You've become part of this rhythm. Your senses tuned to each scrape and side. Another worker arrives with a small iron tool shaped like a chisel. He wedges it under the amphora's lid and pries upward with a practiced flick of his wrist. The seal pops free, releasing a fresh wave of aroma that curls into your sinuses with ruthless familiarity. You don't even flinch this time. You just let it wash over you. The man holding the amphora dips a ladle inside, drawing out a thin stream of liquid that glints in the sun. He tips it into a tiny cup and offers it to the second worker, who sniffs once and nods in silent approval. The ladle goes back in for another measure. You realize this is the final tasting confirmation that nothing has gone wrong before the jars vanish onto the carts. Historians still argue whether this last inspection was symbolic or sincere. You suspect it's a little of both. Remember that damp tunic? It's no longer a nuisance. It's a fact of existence, like the smell, like the ache in your legs. The second worker gestures toward the cart, and the amphora is lifted one last time, nestled into place among its brethren. You watch as a layer of straw is tucked around it, each handful patted flat with slow, steady care. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you can almost hear it buzzing imaginary alerts from a world you're no longer certain you remember clearly. You drift back a step, then another, feeling the heat of the sun pressing between your shoulder blades. You look across the yard and see a fresh cart trundling through the gate, piled high with empty jars waiting their turn. The cycle repeats, and an ending. You draw a breath slow, deliberate, and let your eyes close for just a moment. And when you open them, you know there is still more to see. because this is what it means to visit a Roman fish sauce factory. You can never leave quite the same as you arrived. You stand in the yard a moment longer, feeling the sun harden the salt on your skin into something approaching armor. If only it offered any real protection. A faint vibration trembles through the packed earth beneath your sandals, and you realize it's the rumble of another cart approaching this time. Not to carry away, but to bring in. You step aside as the cart trundles through the gate, wheels grinding over the threshold with a lurch. The driver clocks softly at his mule, who flicks an ear in weary indifference. The cart bed is piled high with sacks tied tight with coarse twine, their sides stamped with crude symbols. As the driver climbs down, a worker moves to untie the nearest sack. The knot gives way, and with a heavy sigh, the bag slumps open to spill its cargo. Fresh anchovies, gleaming in the midday light, their scales reflecting little flickers of silver. The smell is immediate, sharp, almost sweet. A reminder that every barrel of garum starts with something that was, only recently, alive. Remember that damp tunic. It's sticky again. The sun coaxing new sweat from your skin to mingle with the salt crust in ways you'd rather not contemplate. You watch as more sacks are unloaded. One after another, the workers move in a practiced relay lift. Curry. Dump until the air seems alive with the soft slab of fish landing in the troughs. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you imagine checking the time, telling yourself you'd stay just another hour. But you know better now. One man crouches beside a trough, spreading the fish in an even layer with his bare hands. Another follows with a basket of coarse salt, scattering it in slow, looping arcs. You think of snowfall, of childhood games in clean air, and feel a sharp pang of absurd longing. Historians still argue whether these early steps were the most important, whether the quality of the final saucer was decided in these first hours. You suspect they're right. Everything you've seen suggests that no part of the process is insignificant. Every hand, every motion, every grain of salt leaves its mark. You drift closer. Peering into the trough, the anchovies glisten like tiny, pewter statues, their glassy eyes fixed on nothing. A fly lands on one, crawls a little and takes flight again, its wings buzzing a single, plaintive note that fades as quickly as it arrived. Remember the overseer's warning about eels? You almost wish for one now, just for variety. A sudden gust of wind blows in from the yard, lifting your hair from your neck in a momentary gift of coolness. But it also stirs the air, blending the tang of fresh fish with the deeper, settled smell of fermenting vats. You cough once, discreetly, and pretend it helps. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But you wonder if anyone would believe you if you tried to describe this in a message. You imagine the words. It's a place where everything smells alive and dead at the same time. You decide it sounds too dramatic, but you'd send it anyway. At the far end of the trough, a young boy kneels to gather up stray fish that have tumbled onto the floor. His hands move quickly, almost tenderly, as he plucks each one from the dust and lays it back with the others. You watch his concentration, the quiet gravity of his task, and feel something tighten in your chest. Historian still argue whether children here were born into the trade or sold into it. The records don't agree. You suspect the truth is as messy and uncomfortable as the floor under your sandals. Remember that damp tunic. It's heavier by the minute. But you stopped hoping it will dry completely. The driver climbs back onto his cart and clicks his tongue. The mule steps forward with a weary groan, the empty bed rattling behind it. You watch the cart pass through the gate, the driver's silhouette framed by the glare. For an instant, you envy him. He gets to leave, if only to collect the next load. You exhale slowly, feeling the air slip past the taste of salt on your tongue. You wonder, absurdly, if you'll ever crave salt again after this. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you can almost see it in your mind. Glowing with all the small distractions you once believed were important, you turn away from her. Trough, your steps slow and deliberate, as though the yard itself is reluctant to release you. You know by now that nothing here is finished quickly. Everything is a process, incremental and glamorous. Inevitable. You press your palm briefly against the rough beam of the gate before moving on. Because there are still more corners to explore, more labors to witness, and more reasons you will never quite forget this place. You cross the threshold into a lower courtyard just as dusk begins to settle, washing the walls in the kind of soft, forgiving light that makes even this place look almost gentle. Almost. The shadows stretch longer across the stones, pooling in the gaps between barrels and baskets, while a handful of torches flare to life in their brackets. Their flickering glow only seems to deepen the gloom instead of dispelling it. A boy moves past you carrying a fresh torch, the flame spitting little embers into the darkening air. He doesn't look at you, his gaze is fixed on the path ahead, his steps deliberate and tired. You watch the light bob away from you, the darkness gathering behind it like a slow tide. Remember that damp tunic. Now it's cool against your back, the sweat drying into a clammy reminder that your skin has spent all day marinating in the scent of brine dot at the center of the yard. A cluster of workers stands round a massive barrel propped upright on a wooden trestle. One man climbs a narrow ladder, holding a bucket in both hands. As he reaches the top, he tips the contents inside with a hollow glug, then descends without a word. The others wait their turn, each carrying a burden up that narrow climb, each returning empty-handed. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you imagine it buzzing in your pocket, begging you to notice anything else, a message, a headline, a scrap of ordinary life. You ignore the phantom vibration, because there's nowhere to look but here. Historians still argue whether this night shift was truly necessary or simply a way to wring every hour of hell. A bore from the day, you watch the procession up the ladder, down again, and decide it doesn't matter. The effect is the same. The barrel creaks softly as each load settles inside, the staves flexing under the rising weight of liquid and salt. You step closer, careful not to stumble over a coil of rope snaking across the ground. The smell changes subtly here, less like rot, more like something halfway transformed, a note of iron. Of old wood soaked so long it has forgotten what dry air tastes like. Remember, the first time you thought you couldn't stand another hour. That was before you learned each new stage would reveal its own discomfort. A man standing near the barrel glances up and catches your eye. He doesn't smile, but he lifts two fingers in a tired greeting before returning to his work. He braces the ladder with one hand as another worker climbs past, their shadows merging into a single tall shape that flickers in the TORCHLIGHT dot. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you almost reach for it anyway, some part of you still hoping for the illusion of distance. The next worker steps down carrying the empty bucket, which he deposits by a row of smaller barrels waiting their turn. You watch as he rubs his palm across his cheek, smearing a pale crust of salt from his skin. He looks exhausted, but there is a steadiness in him. You recognize by now the acceptance that this is what the night will be. You drift toward the far wall, where a narrow doorway leads into a cramped chamber. Inside, a man crouches over a low brazier, coaxing a small flame to life. The glow outlined shelves stacked with jars and scoops and long-handled ladles, each tool bearing the same faint shimmer of salt. The man doesn't look up, absorbed in his task of heating the iron for sealing. Remember that damp tunic. You catch the faint heat from the brazier and feel it wake every ache in your shoulders. Historians still argue whether garum was considered a luxury worth this labor. You suspect the men here have stopped wondering why they do it. the reasons are less important than the fact that it has to be done. The man by the brazier lifts a thin rod, the tip glowing red. He leans over an amphora resting in a bed of straw and presses the iron to the wax seal. A thin wisp of smoke curls up, carrying a sharper, sweeter smell that cuts through the fishy haze. He waits a moment, then removes the iron and inspects the mark. Satisfied, he sets the tool aside and draws another amphora closer. You step back, careful not to interfere. The air here is dense with heat and that high, metallic tang. But you almost prefer it to the chill outside. Almost. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you imagine tapping out a note. I'm still here. The night shift never ends. The man finishes his second seal and rests his hands on his knees, catching his breath for a moment. Everything is still. The torch is guttering, the brazier glowing, the shadows holding their shape. You feel time stretch, the minutes unfurling in slow, deliberate loops that wrap round your thoughts like twine. Remember the boy with the torch. He pauses again, moving toward the exit, his light bobbing across the yard as the darkness closes behind him. You step back through the doorway and into the open air. The night has settled fully now, heavy and quiet. The workers still climb the ladder. The barrels still creak, and you stand at the edge of it all, witness to a rhythm that will continue long after you leave. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you don't need it anymore. You have everything you came for, pressed into your memory as firmly as a seal in warm wax, and you know there is still more to learn before dawn comes again. You step carefully across the yard, following the path of the boy with the torch. His flame flickers in the cold draft sliding down from the higher walls, each gust carrying a fresh reminder that the air here never truly clears, it just rearranges itself into new and inventive disco. MF4TS at the far end of the courtyard. A line of carts waits to be packed, their wheels chalky with salt dust. You drift toward them, drawn by a soft, rhythmic sound, the scrape of a shovel against the earth. Two men work at the edge of the loading area, digging a shallow trench beneath the lowest row of barrels. Each scrape of the spade lifts a damp, clinging clump of earth that hits the ground with a muffled slap. You step closer, curious despite yourself, and see that the trench is already half full of seepage within, glistening broth escaping from cracked staves. Historians still argue whether this was a flaw in the barrel's design or simply inevitable, a cost baked into the process from the beginning. You watch the men trade the shovel back and forth without speaking, each taking a turn in a silence that feels older than any argument. Remember that damp tunic? It's chilled again, the night air worming under the stiff crust of salt. You wrap your arms across your chest, but the gesture is more habit than comfort. A third worker appears, carrying a battered bucket. He lowers it into the trench, tipping it carefully to skim the surface of the liquid. When he lifts it again, the bucket shines with a dull, pearly sheen, and you feel your stomach contract at the thought of where it will end up. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you can almost feel it in your pocket, a phantom reassurance you no longer expect to find real. The man carries the bucket to a row of amphorae, each one unsealed, waiting to be topped off before transport. He tips the contents inside, then wipes his wrist across his mouth with a sigh that seems to deflate his entire frame. You suspect this is the last step before each jar is closed for good. The final indignity of a process that never wastes anything it can reclaim. A cart creaks as its driver shifts his weight. You glance over to see a mule lifting its head, ears flicking back at some sound you can't hear. For a moment, you envy its blank patience, the way it stands in the middle of this and asks nothing but to be fed and unhitched. Remember the first time you tasted the sauce. You'd almost forgotten how it clung to your tongue. Now, the memory resurfaces with the same thick persistence as the smell. One of the workers straightens and gestures to you, his palm open in invitation. You hesitate, but there's nowhere else to go, so you cross the packed dirt to stand beside him. He points to a smaller amphora set apart from the rest. Its neck is wrapped with a twist of dyed cord-mark, perhaps of special quality or special caution. He says something to low for you to catch, then lifts the lid and tilts it so you can see inside. The surface glints in the torchlight. Thin shimmer of oil floating over the dark liquid below. You realize this amphora holds the first and finest draining, the clear golden layer reserved for the wealthiest buyers. Historians still argue whether these premium batches were truly superior or merely better marketed. You suspect the difference is mostly in the stories people told themselves to justify the price. Meanwhile, your phone is dead. But you know you'd be searching for those stories, now some little thread of trivia to make this moment feel clever. Instead of merely sad, the worker lets the lid fall back into place with a soft thud. He pats the amphora's side, almost gently, then turns away without another word. You stand there a moment longer, feeling the hutch settle around you. Remember that damp tunic. It's beginning to feel like a second skin, though you trade it gladly for anything clean and dry. The wind shifts again, bringing with it the layered perfume of the night. Old salt, fresh fish, warm straw, and something else, something nearly metallic that catches at the back of your throat. You cough once, quietly, and watch a mule's ears twitch at the sound. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you find you don't mind anymore. You're too tired to wish for any barrier between you and this reality. You step back from the amphora, letting your gaze wander across the yard. The men with the trench are still digging. The driver is still waiting. The carts are still being loaded with the same weary care. And you are still here, still watching, still learning that there is no glamour in a process that demands everything and remembers nothing. You turn toward the corridor leading back inside, because you already know there are more chambers waiting, more barrels, more stories you will carry with you, long after the smell finally fades. You step into the next corridor with the quiet resignation of someone who has accepted there is no clean ending to this experience. The torches here burn low, casting more shadow than light, and the air feels heavier for it is close. Damp warmth that clings to your scalp and the hollows of your collarbones. You follow the passage as it curves to the left, your sandals whispering. Against the floor, the walls glisten in places with a slick patina you don't want to examine too closely. Every few paces, a bundle of rope or a stack of tools leans against the plaster, each one etched with the same long history of use. Remember that damp tunic. It has stiffened to the point you feel its folds like ridges pressing into your ribs. You think about peeling it off, but you know it wouldn't matter. Nothing short of fire or a new century will make you clean again. Ahead, a doorway stands, propped open, the lintel scarred by the corners of countless amphorae dragged through it. You pause at the threshold, squinting into the dimness inside. The space feels cavernous, though the ceiling is no higher than any other room. Maybe it's the silence that makes it seem larger, a hutch so complete you almost hold your breath to avoid disturbing it. This is the packing hall. You step across the threshold and see it. Rows upon rows of amphorae lined like sentries waiting for their orders. Some stand sealed, their wax glinting in the torchlight. Others remain open, each one cradling its precious cargo beneath a skin of oil. Historians still argue whether the amphorae were standardized or crafted by region, each kiln's signature hidden somewhere in the curve of the clay. You imagine the potter's hands shaping them, never guessing their work would become a footnote to someone else's trade. Meanwhile, Your phone is dead. But you'd almost like to look up the word for this kind of fatigue, the sort that seeps past muscle and into your sense of self. You drift forward, your hand trailing lightly along the nearest jar. The clay is cool under your fingertips, rough in places where the glaze thinned. You wonder how many times it has been handled, weighed, inspected, how many hours of labor each one represents. At the far end of the hall, a man kneels by a stack of lids, each disc marked with a splash of red pigment. He sorts them with slow care, tapping them one by one against the floor before setting them aside. His movements are so measured they seem almost ritualistic, an unspoken contract between him and the countless jars waiting to be closed. Remember the boy with the torch? You can still see the memory of his light etched on the backs of your eyelids. The man looks up as you approach, his face impassive. He gestures to a small amphora propped upright on a crate. A lid rests beside it, a fine thread of wax already coiled in readiness. You understand the invitation he means for you to watch the final step. You nod and stand back as he lifts the lid in both hands. He sets it over the jar's mouth with exquisite precision, adjusting it until it sits flush. Then he reaches for the length of wax, warming it briefly in his palm before pressing it into the seam. The smell of warmed resin rises sharp and oddly sweet, and for one suspended moment, it almost chases away the other odors. Historians still argue whether this sealing method was meant to keep the sauce fresh or simply to reassure the buyer it hadn't been tampered with. You suspect it did both. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you can almost feel the phantom weight of it, a small reminder of everything waiting for you beyond these walls. The man smooths the last coil into place, pressing it down with the flat of his thumb. When he's satisfied, he sets the amphora aside with the others. For a moment, he simply sits there, hand resting on the clay as though reluctant to move. You think you understand. After a day spent in this work, you too would be slow to let go. Remember that damp tunic. It feels like a keepsake now, a badge of your witness, something you'll carry back into the clean air whether you want it or not. The man reaches for the next lid, and you take that as your cue to leave. You step carefully between the rows, the torchlight bending and rippling across the jars as you pass. Each amphora is a story sealed in silence, destined to disappear into kitchens and marketplaces where no one will ever consider the hands that packed them. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you're no longer sure you'd check it even if it burst to life. The here and now has claimed you more fully than you ever planned. At the doorway, you turn back for one last look. The man has resumed his slow work. The amphorae wait in their orderly ranks. The resin still curls in little threads where it pooled along the seams. You stand in the hush and let the moment sink into your bones, because you know, in the quiet part of your mind, this will be the image you remember long after the smell finally fades. You step out of the packing hall, feeling the hush behind you recede like a tide. The corridor is narrower here, the walls pressing close as if to shepherd you towards some final reckoning. Your sandals whisper over the worn stones, each step a small declaration that you are still here, still following this process to its bitter end. The passage curves gently to the right, and then you see it, a doorway standing open to the dawn. The sky beyond glows pale blue, streaked with the first light of morning. You realize with a start that you have been inside long enough for night to slip past you unnoticed. Remember that damp tunic. Now it's only cool fabric hugging your back, the sweat dried to a residue that feels as much a part of you as your skin. You pause at the threshold, reluctant to cross it. A final look behind you shows nothing. At the dark passage, torch stubs guttering low in their brackets, the last few workers drift past you in silence. their eyes fixed on the exit with the same exhausted determination. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you imagine the soft chime of an alarm, a reminder that somewhere beyond these walls, the day has begun for other people in simpler ways. You step into the yard. The air is crisp in the early light, and for an instant you almost believe it's fresh until the breeze shifts and carries the layered perfume of everything you have seen. Salt, fish, resin, sweat. It's so familiar now that you don't bother. Flinching dot near the gate. Your cart waits, piled high with sealed amphorae. A mule stamps one foot, ears flicking as a driver tightens the harness straps. You watch them move with slow competence, a choreography that feels inevitable. Historians still argue whether these export shipments were the true engine of Rome's commerce or just a profitable sideshow. W to grain and all. You suspect the empire didn't care much about distinctions as long as the jars kept moving. You drift closer to the cart, drawn by a final compulsion to see this process through. A worker lifts a lid on one amphora, peering inside as though to reassure himself it has not evaporated in the night. He nods once, set aside, and seals it again with a practiced flick of the wrist. Remember the first moment you stepped off the boat, certain you wouldn't last an hour. You smile faintly, because somehow you did. The driver looks up and catches your eye. He doesn't nod or speak, just studies you for a heartbeat before turning back to his mule. It feels like the simplest kind of acknowledgement. You've been here. You've witnessed this. You're part of the memory now. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but you wouldn't reach for it if it sprang to life. No screen could capture the taste of this place on your tongue, the weight of its hours in your legs. You glance over your shoulder one last time. The yard is bathed in morning light now, softening the edges of everything, the cracked amphorae, the discarded ropes, the smudges of salt all look almost gentle in this new illumination. Almost. You take a slow breath and feel it fill the hollow places inside you, the ache in your shoulders, the stiffness in your calves, the gritty film on your skin. Every discomfort settles into something you almost recognize as gratitude. Because you came here expecting to learn what it was like to visit a Roman fish sauce factory. And now you know. Remember that damn tunic. You will carry its memory long after the fabric itself is gone. You step away from the cart, turning your face to the pale sky. For the first time in hours, you feel the tiniest lift in your chest, the knowledge that you are almost free. Almost. Meanwhile, your phone is dead, but your mind is wide awake. You walk through the gate. Tonight you've traveled far farther than you ever expected, into the damp corridors of a place where empire and labor met in quiet, briny persistence. You have stood in the salting yards and watched the fish piled in endless ranks, breathed the air of the fermentation pits that blurred the line between disgust and awe. You've traced the small, human rituals that turned decay into commerce, the ladles and lids, the torches flickering over tired hands, the soft words exchanged in the hush before dawn. Now, as you return to your own quiet room, you can feel how those hours have settled inside you. Every ache in your shoulders, every imagined taste on your tongue, is a testament to something real and unglamorous, something that built the world behind the monuments. Let yourself soften into this moment. Let the memory fade from its sharpest edges to a simple understanding that every jar of garum began with days like this, with people who rose before light and worked past exhaustion. That sometimes the history you think you know is really 1,000 hidden stories layered together, salted and sealed. Feel your breath slow. Feel the room round you grow calm. Feel how your own life, so distant from this place, is precious in ways you may never have noticed until now. Tonight, your story can rest. The amphorae are packed, the gates have closed, and you are here, in the quiet gift of modern life. Where no one demands you stand in the dark counting fish, close your eyes. Thank the warm water, the fresh clothes, the clean air waiting for you. You have earned it.